fought for the Constitution. Once it was enacted, they regressed to defending their regional interests. Hamilton was fortunate in his timing. He had jumped off the starting block with his report on public credit even before Jefferson had returned from France to take his position as Secretary of State. Hamilton immediately asked for Jefferson's help in mediating the conflict with Madison. Before Jefferson had time to give the matter much thought, in this brief honeymoon period, everyone in Washington's cabinet hoped to be able to work together. To settle this conflict quickly, Jefferson invited Hamilton and Madison to his home for what Joseph Ellis has dubbed the dinner. A deal emerged. If Hamilton would throw his support behind the Potomac area as the home of the new nation's capital, Madison would desist from actively obstructing Hamilton's economic plan. Locating the capital there would be good for Virginians. Perhaps equally important, it would be good for Madison, who had joined Henry Lee in a grandiose speculation to acquire lands on the falls of the Potomac. It is probably no coincidence that the 4 congressmen who agreed to switch their votes in favor of Hamilton's financial plan all hail from districts bordering on the soon-to-be booming Potomac. That would be the last thing Thomas Jefferson would ever do to help Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson soon came to believe that Hamilton was something of a demon. Hamilton biographer Thomas Fleming told me, in Jefferson's mind, Hamilton's efforts to build a strong central government looked like a counter-revolutionary plot to bring back monarchy. His efforts to hasten America's commercial and industrial development signaled the death of Jefferson's rural idea. For Jefferson and his followers, wedded to their vision of a agrarian Eden, Hamilton was the American Mephistopheles, the proponent of such devilish contrivances as banks, factories, and stock exchanges. Jefferson's campaign to destroy Hamilton began early in Washington's first term. Too well-mannered and clever to attack directly, he worked secretly through minions. He was a very, very devious man, said Fleming. Jefferson hired Madison's College of New Jersey classmate Philip Freneau, putting him on the State Department's payroll as a translator. His real mission was to publish a newspaper to malign Hamilton personally and discredit his policies. Defending his honor and his mission always gave Hamilton a new surge of energy. He slashed back, publishing numerous letters and newspaper articles refuting the Freneau attacks. Jefferson complained to Madison that Hamilton was single-handedly out-publishing their whole organization. He is a host unto himself, replied Madison in defense. In another scheme to get Hamilton, Jefferson worked secretly through Virginia Congressman William Branch Giles. Jefferson saw to it that a 9-point report accusing Hamilton of corruption was submitted to Congress, but Hamilton parried that attack too, working feverishly through 2 days of all-night sessions. Hamilton composed a defense and was acquitted. The whirling dervish spun out of their trap. In 1792, the Republicans finally struck pay dirt when they caught Hamilton in an adulterous affair with a 23-year-old woman named Maria Reynolds. Her husband had blackmailed Hamilton for $1,000 to keep the affair quiet. When later arrested on other charges, Mr. Reynolds offered to exchange false damning information against Hamilton for leniency. He claimed that Hamilton had conspired with him to speculate in government securities. James Monroe, along with 2 other Republican congressmen, confronted Hamilton with the charges. Hamilton confessed to the affair, believing that as a gentleman they would keep it secret, but offered convincing evidence that he hadn't been involved in any impropriety outside his personal life. When the affair was made public, Hamilton came close to demanding a duel with Monroe, who believed had leaked the secret. Monroe had, he told Jefferson, who secretly paid yellow journalist James calendar to publicize the scandal, along with the unsubstantiated accusations of corruption. Hamilton counterpunched again against the strenuous advice of his friends. Hamilton published a tract freely admitting to the improper sexual relationship but denying the charge of corruption. The pamphlet became a bestseller. Hamilton's personal reputation was slightly tarnished, but suspicions of official misconduct were dropped. Bancomania. The second stage of Hamilton's economic plan was the creation of a national bank. The bank would print paper currency, providing society with the liquid capital needed for virtually every commercial transaction. Currency would also facilitate the collection of taxes by the Treasury. There was a great suspicion of paper money at that time, and some farmers vowed to boycott it. The bank could also lend the government money in emergencies such as war. It would regulate the national banking system, and as Hamilton had indicated in the plan he had mailed to Morris, it would issue shares of stock. Compared to the assumption of state debts, the bank sailed through Congress, but the vote followed north-south lines. 19 of the 20 no votes were southern states. Jefferson, Madison, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph, all Virginians, urged their fellow Virginian, President Washington, to veto the bill on the grounds that it was unconstitutional. They pointed out that nowhere in the Constitution did it explicitly mention the authority to create a bank. The notion that the federal government was prohibited from doing anything not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution was such a rigidly strict interpretation that it would not only have killed the bank but destroyed the federal government's ability to govern. To Hamilton's alarm, Washington seemed to be swayed by these absurd arguments. He told Hamilton he was leaning towards vetoing the bank bill and even asked Madison to draft the text of the veto. Hamilton was dumbfounded. He had never dreamed of Washington's doubting. Hamilton threw himself into the writing frenzy mode to compose a response. He stayed up all night on February 22nd, 1791, and had the document on Washington's desk the next day. The ability to work on little sleep is one of the more concrete diagnostic criteria for hypomania. Though we know little of Hamilton's sleep habits generally, he was able to forego sleep when necessary. Hamilton's response argued that the federal government was vested with the implied powers required to conduct its business effectively. Those powers were limited only by what was prohibited by the Constitution, a position that would later be supported by John Marshall, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. 48 hours after receiving Hamilton's report, Washington signed the bank bill. If the assumption of state debts had sparked rampant speculation, it was nothing compared to the mania that swirled around stock in the Bank of the United States. All 20,000 shares issued in July 1791 were sold within an hour. A brisk market in bank shares sprang up immediately, with furious buying and selling, a delirium of speculation. In the grips of this bancomania, as one newspaper called it, shares quickly quadrupled in value. The national bank stock has risen so high, so enormously above its real value, that no transaction in the annals of history can be found to equal it, wrote one newspaper. It was America's first speculative bubble. At first, Hamilton was delighted to see the brisk demand for shares in his bank. But as the bubble expanded, he could see disaster on the horizon. He wrote a colleague, "These extravagant sallies of speculation do injury to the government and to the whole system of public credit by disgusting all sober citizens and giving a wild air to everything." He feared that chaos would ensue when the bubble burst. It did. The domino that made all the others fall was Hamilton's trusted friend, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, William Duer. Hamilton saw that Duer was speculating wildly in bank bonds, risking both his reputation and that of Hamilton's department. He wrote to Duer that he had gone further than was consistent either with your own safety or the public good. My friendship for you and my concern for the public cause were both alarmed. Hamilton would have been far more alarmed if he had known how far Duer had gone. In March 1792, Dewar borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars to purchase huge amounts of stock on margin. Had the market risen, Dewar would have become the richest man in America, but the market dipped and Dewar couldn't cover his positions. His failure set off a chain reaction. His rich partners couldn't cover their poor positions either. As they discovered too late, Dewar had stolen their money along with the $250,000 from the U.S. Treasury to place his gigantic wager. Dewar was whisked away to prison, where he eventually died. The collapse of so many prominent financiers set off a panic. Jefferson wrote to Thomas Randolph with some satisfaction that the gambling scoundrels were going down like 9 pins. Overstating the case, he wrote that every man concerned in the paper was broke, including most of New York. The Panic of 1792 has the distinction of being the first financial panic in American history, yet somehow Hamilton knew what to do. The head of the U.S. Treasury marched into the marketplace and bought thousands of shares, promising further repurchases. Prices recovered, the market stabilized. Hamilton saw no inconsistency in continued Treasury purchase of bonds. The bull market was good for business, attracted foreign capital to America, and gave the new government an aura of confidence and success. In May 1792, as a direct response to the Dewar disaster, a group of 25 merchants decided to bring some order to this chaotic trade in government securities by organizing a stock market. They met daily to trade bonds under the shade of a large buttonwood tree on Wall Street in Manhattan. They formalized their association in a document quaintly called the Buttonwood Agreement. One day this group would name itself the New York Stock Exchange. Eventually would trade in public companies as well as government securities, providing capital for canal companies, then railroads, then automobiles, forever fueling America's expansion. The creation of the stock market was just one result of Hamilton's miracle. Alexander Hamilton issued the final recommendation for the American economy, report on manufacturers, in 1791. He wrote that Americans had a peculiar aptitude for mechanic improvements, which, along with Americans' spirit of enterprise, would someday make the American economy the admiration and envy of the world. Hamilton's recommendation as to how government could strengthen industry were contemptuously ignored. Instead of being forced or fostered by public authority, it ought to be seen with regret, wrote Madison. To Jefferson, who believed that those who labor in the earth are the people of God, industrialization was the apple in the American Eden. A decade later, even Jefferson was forced to admit that growth in American manufacturing was necessary to avoid a crippling dependence on Europe. He conceded the point most reluctantly: our enemy has the consolation of Satan on removing our first parents from paradise. From a peaceable and agricultural nation, he makes us a military and manufacturing one. During Hamilton's tenure, the American economy took off. Exports and shipping doubled, 100% economic growth. Hamilton exuberantly called his economic miracle a spectacle of national happiness never surpassed, if ever before equaled in the annals of human affairs. In 1801, Jefferson would occupy the White House. The Virginia Republicans would maintain control over the piece of valuable Potomac real estate for 24 years, a generation. Years later, Jefferson would bitterly regret having hosted the dinner and having made that deal with Hamilton on the federal assumption of debt. He claimed that it had been the worst political decision he ever made, but by then it was too late. Hamiltonian economics had saved America. The fall of Alexander Hamilton. This American world was not made for me. During Washington's 2 terms in office, Hamilton was the president's chief advisor, and Hamilton's own power flowed in large part from his special connection with Washington. Hamilton was filled with bitterness when, in 1799, he learned that Washington had died. It was not just a matter of personal grief. Washington was an aegis very essential to me. Aegis is the Greek word for shield. With Washington gone, Hamilton lost his protector. Unlike Jefferson, who had built a national party, Hamilton had no political organization. He had admiring colleagues, but no Praetorian Guard, said Kennedy. Furthermore, without Washington's steady hand, Hamilton began to make mistakes. He shot himself in the foot with his own party, the Federalists. In opposition to President Adams, who was seeking re-election in 1800, Hamilton backed another Federalist candidate, Charles Pinckney, a second-rate South Carolina politician who had nothing to offer except that he could be controlled by Hamilton. The result was that he split the Federalist vote, handing him his enemy Jefferson the presidency. It was arguably the worst mistake of Hamilton's political career. Members of his own party were understandably furious with him. An enraged Adams called Hamilton the most restless, impatient, artful, indefatigable, and unprincipled intriguer in the United States, if not the world. The Republicans were now poised to destroy everything Hamilton had built, or so he thought, and it was to a large extent his own fault. Suddenly, it seemed that he was despised in the very country he had helped create. There is something terrible going on in this country, he brooded, when a man can be turned into a demon. The depth of his depression is revealed in this letter addressed to his friend, Gouverneur Morris. Mine is an odd destiny. Perhaps no man in the United States has sacrificed or done more for the present Constitution than myself. Yet I have the murmurs of its friends no less than the curses of its foes. What can I do better than withdraw from the scene? Every day proves to me more and more that this American world was not made for me. For the first time, Hamilton was leading a one-man retreat.